and I will read them out, or maybe our other speakers can have a go, can take a stab at answering them as we're going. And I'm going to start with Vahini Naidu. Previously, Vahini's led on digital trade within the government of South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry. She was a lead negotiator for South Africa at the World Trade Organization. And today she's the program coordinator for the South Centre's Trade and Development Programme. And the South Centre does some fantastic work providing the expertise and coordination needed on trade policy for the many countries who simply cannot afford the expertise of dozens of trade negotiators every time a World Trade Organization rolls around. So Vahini, thank you for the work you do, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to share my slides. Okay, so thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be participating in this. Since I don't have much time, I really just want to get into some of the key challenges that's facing the Global South, particularly in the WTO. So at the outset, of course, the kind of overall context that we're operating in is a re-emergence of industrial policy. We are seeing much greater state-led interventions, particularly with subsidies, and also an increased, or rather an exponential increase in trade protectionism and unilateral trade measures. And this is, of course, having a negative impact generally in the global economy. Now, one of the kind of main narratives being advanced in the WTO has been this notion to mainstream the SDGs in the WTO. And this has been fundamentally problematic because, as we know, a lot of the outcomes in the WTO are never really development-centric. And that's kind of the central role of why we have the SDGs. So as an example, last year, June, at the MC12, trade ministers had adopted an agreement on fisheries subsidies. Now, this was kind of hyped in the media as being the first agreement in the WTO to ever address kind of environmental sustainability. But one of the biggest...
For instance, the trade-related intellectual property rights facilitated monopoly runs and diminished the possibility of technology transfer. And trade-related investment measures has disallowed members to use local content requirements and many industrial policy tools. And the trade rules on subsidies constrain the policy space for developing countries need to nurture their industries. And however, these very provisions and industrial policy tools allowed advanced economies to provide substantial support throughout their industrialization history. And yet they are using them now to encourage the reshoring of traditional manufacturing and to keep leading positions in emerging industries, including in high-tech, knowledge-intensive industries deemed critical for their future prosperity. And the agreement on agriculture, which is one of the major interests based on which developing countries signed on to this multilateral processes, has allowed developed countries to continue their high subsidies in agricultural products, including those exported to developing countries, impacting their small farmers and livelihood and food security. And developing countries have called for certain reforms of WTO since 1996 to address to these asymmetries, but this reform agenda put forth by developing members were incorporated in the Doha Development Agenda. But these processes have been derailed since then. The kind of reform agenda called by the developing countries include the strengthening of special and differential treatment provisions, various implementation issues in order to address existing asymmetries in the WTO agreements, particularly in agriculture with a view to facilitating the realization of food security and poverty alleviation goals. As well as the TRIPS agreement does not should not be preventing members from taking measures to protect public health. They're also one of the major demands from the developing countries. However, increasingly the WTO is moving away from the principles entailed in the basis of its foundation and the Marrakesh Agreement and the negotiation mandate contained in the Doha Development Agenda, which sought to place the needs and interests of developing countries at the heart of the program, has been done away with. So there are core principles of multilateral trading system and rules regarding the decision making and how the amendments are made and need to be retained. And there is the need for the continuation of the practice of decision making by consensus, and the special and differential treatment should be treaty embedded, and it should be a non-negotiable right for developing countries. And this renewed focus is required for some of those long-standing demands on the implementation issues. And moving away from the developmental focus of the WTO, and with the proliferation of joint statement initiatives across the sectors, and it's indeed it's going against the developmental mandate, the developmental demands of the developing countries. And the WTO processes should keep developmental at its core through delivering the long promised developmental concerns. And in particular, outstanding developmental issues in Doha Development Agenda should also be considered. And particularly the post-COVID situations where the developing countries, the concerns and the challenges have increased multifold. And we need a renewed focus on multilateralism. And the problems that the world is facing is of global in nature, and the solution should also be a joint multilateral processes, and a continued focus on corporate interest and delivering seeking solutions for market access, new market access, and the focus on corporate interest and the interest of developed countries will not lead to solutions that's suitable for everyone. So we need to keep the development at its core in the multilateral processes, and the WTO should come back to its promise of delivering the development. And I stop here.
Thanks very much, Manicandan. I thought that was, such an important point about the way that trade rules, as they currently exist, structure southern countries' economies in deeply unhelpful ways. And we all saw the consequences of that during the pandemic, right, where because of the TRIPS agreement, this knowledge, and we're supposed to live in a knowledge economy, but effectively was walled off and was hoarded by a handful of corporations, and that meant that it was equitable access to vaccines was impossible, and indeed ending the pandemic in a way it should have been ended was impossible. And you can only begin to imagine, if the same dynamic plays out in climate change, how disastrous that's going to be for all of us. So there is a real urgency in changing these rules. Keep thinking about your questions and putting them in boxes. There is a question in there which I think is probably one for Leo, but keep thinking and putting them in there as our speakers are presenting. A great pleasure now to introduce Luciana Ghiotto, an old friend of mine, a professor for international political economy in Buenos Aires, where she's based, a researcher at CONICET-Argentina, and an associate researcher with Transnational Institute. Luciana is a leading expert on trade and investment regimes in the Latin American region, but also a tireless campaigner and activist against neoliberal trade deals there. Luciana, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. It's such a pleasure to be sharing with you this, well, morning in Argentina right now, 9:30 here. And I was thinking that, yeah, while you were saying, like, you can say it also like an old campaigner already. It's like 25 years already working on these issues. So it's been like a long road coming to where we are now. First of all, I'm going to try to use wisely my 10 minutes, but I wanted to bring to you some reflections or some ideas regarding the topic of this moment where we're gathering together to discuss trade, which is this idea of trade justice. And I always try to think of the systemic approach to the idea of trade justice, because I appreciate very much the WTO approach to discussions on trade, but I was thinking that sometimes we have a problem as activists. I'm going to try to bring a problem. Yeah, why not? I mean, after 25 years, I can bring the problems over. It's that we usually focus too much on trade. And we forget something that this guy, well, I was preparing a class for university. This guy, this Karl Marx guy, some years ago, he explained that trade is a part of capital, that is circulation, the circulation of capital. So we focus too much on trade sometimes, and we tend, the trade campaigners, I'm a trade campaigner, and we tend to forget the part where production is made. So we tend to see the whole picture of how capitalism works. And when we talk about trade justice, that it's why it's usually not like the best phrase for me, although I know we use it a lot, this idea of trade justice, climate justice, it's okay, but it's like we have to find a way to explain the situation of trade right now by explaining how the system works. So it's like when you in Europe say this idea of change the system, not the climate, I think that for trade, it should be used the same. It's like change the system, not just trade. So it's like, this is like a first point that I wanted to bring. Is like, the commodities are produced in the production system, in the industrial system, and then they are realized, Marx said, in trade, in circulation of capital. So we have to see the whole picture there. But I want to, well, of course, try to focus on what happens with trade, but keeping this perspective in mind. And I wanted to bring to you 3 facts. Let's see if I can bring this over in my now 8 minutes. First of all, it's first fact. Fact 1 is this idea of that trade and investments have been used as a tool to guarantee capital profit. This is something almost undeniable. For the past 25 years, 30 years already, 30 years already, we have seen the reproduction of these free trade agreements. We have already more than 200 free trade agreements. We have more than 3,000 bilateral investment treaties in the world. We have over 1,200 ISDS claims. For people who don't know, ISDS is investor-state dispute settlements, this mechanism that allows the investors to make claims against states when they see their profits modified in any way, or that it's put in danger by any public policy. As Nick, you were saying before, we're always discussing the space for public policy, right? And what we see with this, in this first fact, we see that these agreements have completely reduced the policy space. This is not new. This is just one fact, and we have to already know that there are so many research in academia, in UNCTAD, in CEPAL, in Latin America, everywhere. We know, we have seen people from the law saying that this system is not working for human rights and for environmental rights. So this is fact 1. Then the second fact is how trade agreements have become more and more complex in these 30 years since NAFTA, this North America Free Trade Agreement that we saw in 1994. Next year is 30 years of NAFTA. So we can talk about these 3 decades of how trade has evolved. It has evolved in a very clear way. When we analyze, with the nerds of trade, analyze the different texts of the trade agreements, we see how NAFTA was these big agreements in this context of the change of geopolitics after the elimination of the Soviet Union, and we have these first years of the 90s being the decade of everything's wrong, states are in crisis, trade unions in crisis, is the end of history, end of geography. In that context, we have the NAFTA and the WTO guys were speaking before. We have that moment of like the beginning, but trade agreements have evolved in a very clear way. We can compare the texts. We have, after that, we have the FTAA, the ALCA, although it was never signed, it's not into force. You have the drafts, so we can analyze the drafts and see how telecommunications, services chapters, they have more and more complex in order to guarantee a capital profit. And in the last years, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, well, now the Great Britain is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, you have, yeah, that's beautiful. I love trade agenda. It's like Great Britain is a Pacific country now that it's part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have e-commerce chapters, you have regulatory cooperation, which is it's a huge topic, and it's directly related to the new topics that are also in discussion in WTO, which are trade facilitation, investment facilitation, which is let's make everything simpler, less complex, quicker for capital circulation, and of course, commodity circulation. What we have there is that the complexity of the trade agenda has to relate to the new needs of profit and how to guarantee profits. One of the last topics, or the latest topics that we're seeing inside trade agreements, especially for the European Union, is energy and raw materials chapters. We are working on that in TNI, where there's going to be a report very soon especially on how the EU agenda is included in every new FTA that they are signing, energy and raw materials chapters with Chile, with Mexico, with Tunisia, Indonesia, India, New Zealand, and we'll see that coming up every time. And then the last point, the last fact that I want to bring, disputes over trade have increased in time. And I want to bring 3 points on this. This is obvious. These are obvious facts for us, but let's organize this information. First, the effects. We know what the effects of the trade agenda, of the trade liberalization agenda is. Where, for example, I work in Latin America. We have 25 years of trade agreements in Latin America. We see how all the promises that were made in the 90s were not accomplished, none of them. That they were going to bring more investment, that they were going to create more jobs, that they were going to bring more technology, that they were actually going to bring cooperation between the nations, that they were going to diversify our exports. We see that none of this happened. So we have the facts on our side. We have to show those facts. We need researchers to show how this has affected. And so these disputes that we see that are appearing everywhere, we know that they are because the effects have been terrible for people, for environment, and for human rights agenda. Then the second point of this third fact. Today, the new ideas that are being brought, we are in a deglobalization era. So we see deglobalization. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that thesis. And then the return of geopolitics. So we have now this idea of now we have geopolitics back. So if geopolitics are back, then we have BRICS and China and the Global South, as my partners here were explaining. The Global South has a discourse, has a speech that says, well, we have to stop free trade because these developed nations were not developed. They didn't get to where they are, as Hashong Chang says. They didn't get where they are with free trade. They got there because they use subsidies, credits, and huge power of states to protect internal capital, to protect national capital to get where they are. So this is something that we are going to see many more of these disputes over trade in the next years. And then the third point, and I'm closing with this, Nick, is that we see people, our organizations, we still focus on trade. It's almost 25 years from the Seattle battle. We know that we still have truth on our side, but the problem or the question is, how do we convince other sectors, even other movements, to include the trade agenda, the trade topic, the trade focus on their everyday working agendas. For example, the environmental movement and the women's movement also. Women, and with this I close, the women topic in trade is super important. We have seen this appear in G20, for example. We see the new chapters that are presented as super modern inside trade agreements that are the gender and trade chapters, but actually they are these completely superficial chapters that have no actual change in women's life, who are the most affected by the trade policies everywhere in the world, not only in the global south, but also in the north, because it's women that get to services, that get to medicines, they actually are the providers of these things as caretakers for their families. So what we see is that this agenda affects women in particular. So how do we create a bridge there between our trade agenda and the women's movement and the environmental movement? Those are questions that will be super important for trade justice discussions and for a trade agenda and work in the future. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Luciana, for covering so much. And yeah, I think your point about the move in a way away from hyperglobalization in the West, the move towards industrial strategies, potentially being based upon really extreme neo-colonial resource grabs from other countries. And that's a huge threat for us. But does it also present an opportunity to change and rewire the trade system? I think it's a massive question. I'm going to go on to the last speaker, Olabisi Akinkugbe, an associate professor and professor of law at Dalhousie University, a former legal associate and founding editor of Afronomics.org blog and the African Journal of International Economic Law. His research has explored just and equitable trade with a focus on Africa and the global south, looking particularly at climate justice, human rights, illicit financial flows, and regional trade agreements. Bisi, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nick, and thanks to your organization for putting this together, and congratulations as well on the 20th. So I think what the panelists, my fellow panelists have done so well is really teasing out a broad range of issues that are, in some sense global, in particular senses regional, but also quite overlapping in their nature. In my view, I think what is clear is that we are in an era of fragmentation. Whether one agrees with the notion of deglobalization or the need to reglobalize, those are conceptual frameworks. And I think in some sense, they risk losing the focus if we bother too much about that. Fragmentation is occurring in different areas. And one key area where we see this happening across various regions really is in the changing landscape for institutional regulation, right? So the institutional fragmentation of trade governance. This really follows a lot of what has been put on the table by Luciana, in the sense that you do look at it historically, whereas multilateralism was, hailed and everybody hoped that what the WTO had in its early days will continue. What has happened is a gradual retreat from that cohesive approach to trade governance, and almost even a spearhead by the champions of multilateralism at moving away from that. So you do think about the type of agreements that the US is entering into today. These are not your classic plurilaterals that we're even talking about. You're looking at what some scholars have described as mini trade deals. But they more or less circumvent the WTO multilateral regime and looks at other ways of doing things. What is key, though, in my own maybe now 7 minutes for the purpose of today's intervention, is about the African region. The truth is that we cannot think about this fragmentation in the institutional governance of the trading regime without thinking about the role of regions and the efforts that are being made by various regional organizations. Admittedly, these are organizations that have an exceptional status under the WTO rules. But what we defined is that through regions and through a lot of the fragmentation that has happened, there is a new reawakening to questioning the type of initiatives that are happening, whether it's in the Asian, whether it's in the Latin American or the African context. In Africa, at the height of the trade war between China and the US about 4 or 5 years ago, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement was born. And this agreement is one that follows on a huge effort by African states to try to create a uniform negotiating platform that offers them, that capitalizes on their strength in numbers, but also puts the region as a bloc much more powerful in negotiating with its counterparts across the world. I think what I don't need to repeat in the time I have is the fact that you can think about the AfCFTA against different backgrounds. You can think about it against the neo-colonial trope that both Nick and my other panelists have talked about. You can think about it in the context of enhancing industrialization for the region and building in its own way, as opposed to just being an extractive or primary product supplier to the world. You can also think about it as a way of just being a meaningful actor in the global trade regime. But what has happened since then is the fact that the role of externalities, right, and I use that broadly, or if you like, external factors, have again come to play in the way this agreement is likely to be implemented. And I'm saying likely to be implemented specifically to raise eyebrow, because you might say, isn't it being implemented already? Well, that's the question we have to ask ourselves about how much the needle is moving with respect to the aspirations of the agreements to truly do all it has said in the agreement. I want to be clear. My view about the AfCFTA is not a pessimist one. I'm an optimist. I try to see where things are moving. So there are reports that have been produced, which I can share the links in the chat once I've finished speaking, that tries to articulate certain movements, especially even during the COVID era, where African states were truly doing their best to ensure that they responded to the needs of the region. But one key example I want to use, which shows the fragmentation in the institutional regime and which counters in a very worrying way advancements in the region, is the free trade area agreement that is being negotiated by the US with Kenya. And so you do think about it at a time when the AfCFTA seems to be gathering momentum. This is precisely the time that Kenya has gone ahead to start this negotiation under former President Trump's administration. And then, there are rumors it might be continued again now under the Biden administration. What is key is that this particular agreement, championed by a lot of lobbyists from the US, really seeks to erode a lot of Kenya's, for example, environmental protection rights. If you think about its agriculture, it thinks about textile, amongst other areas. And so what we see today, we're thinking broadly about trade justice, because I am conscious we want to leave time to have questions, is that a lot of the old challenges that we've spoken about have not left. In fact, what we have seen is a cascading of a lot of them into new challenges. And so critical raw materials represent one. The whole CBAM argument represents another, right? How these provisions are making their way into various trade and investment agreements represent another. Yet, what remains constant is a very worrying lack of industrialization, even in an era of renewed industrial policy by African states and other global South countries. And so I think as we move forward, we do need to think about how we advance the need for global South countries to truly take the policy space back, as you started, Nick, in the opening space, and really advance their own trade policy that will be useful for this century and the future that we expect. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much. Basically, well within time. So we've got a few questions now, and we've only got 10 minutes. But I'd like to try and get bring everybody back in for at least a minute, if that's possible. Bisi, I appreciate you answered a question from Elisa around the growing protectionism in global trade, particularly coming from Western states. Is that reflected in trade policy of global South countries? Is there stuff that we can look at in global South countries that we can draw some kind of hope from, I guess, as well, in terms of the kind of system that we might want to see? Back in the 90s, when we were in the anti-globalization movement, many of us looked to some of the so-called pink tide governments in Latin America for that alternative trade model. Where do we see that hope coming from today? Elisa, I've kind of perverted your question a bit there, but hopefully there's still something a bit left. And Bisi, I know you answered that a bit, but maybe you could come back on that one, and Vahini too, and anyone else who wants to. There's a few other questions in one, Luciana, for you, agreeing with your analysis and the need for a systemic approach. What does this mean for the arguments made by earlier speakers on the need to reform the WTO and make it work in the interest of the global South? Is this viable? Is it a viable option? Big question there. And Vahini, you may want to come in on that one as well. A big question here about the garment industry that Bisi may be most relevant for you to ask, but any of you are very welcome to come in on it. And what else have we got here? Oh, one about TRIPS and COVID, and the US government yesterday published its long-awaited report on TRIPS and COVID, and whether the waivers, the very, very minimal waivers on TRIPS that were finally agreed by the WTO after many months of debating and stalling. Do any of you seen that report? Do you have comments on it? And are we getting any closer, I guess, learning those awful lessons of the pandemic? There's loads there. Don't try and take all of it, but maybe pull out the bits of the questions that you've seen in the box that you would like to answer, and see where you can get in a minute. Shall I go back in the same order, Vahini?
Okay, thank you. This is a lot to cover. Just in summary, I think maybe I should say that, with the introduction of the private sector in the WTO and this question about codex, I think we remain extremely skeptical that something truly positive can really come out of the agenda. We also note the multi-stakeholderism approach in the United Nations Global Digital Compact negotiations. And we remain really concerned because, the foundational issues, the structural imbalances with the digital economy, for example, will not be addressed. And from the policy briefs coming out of the UN, we're not seeing that this will be legitimately addressed in the GDC. So very similar, patterns are emerging in the WTO, but this is really from its long, almost 3-decade history of the WTO and its WTO days of extremely asymmetrical and inequitable agreements and trade rules against developing countries. And so with the inclusion of the private sector, and I did a quick check, the business advisory group includes stakeholders, for example, from Standard Charter, the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Association, Coronation Capital, for example. So I cannot imagine what possible development-oriented outcomes these associations and these industries are going to contribute to WTO rules. I think that the introduction or giving them a space in the WTO is actually going to entrench a culture of fear and a culture of only being kind of drawn and advanced by mercantilist interests. And unfortunately, it's developing countries and the least developed countries who will suffer the most from these bad trade rules. And just to mention that, this issue about the growing protectionism, I think primarily it is coming from the global north. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Battery Alliance, we have Japan with their supply chain initiatives as well. The UK is also coming out with things. So the biggest kind of systemic problem is that in the context of this green revolution, we are increasingly going to see measures or punitive measures being levied on developing countries. So their goods will basically have a much harder time being traded on the pretext that they are not environmentally friendly. And so I think within this context, it's extremely unfair. And this introduction of the trade and environment and the climate change agenda in the WTO is also extremely problematic if international environmental law principles like common but differentiated responsibilities does not enter the WTO narrative. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Also got a question here from, I don't think everybody can see the Q&A, right? Only we can say that, see that. So maybe Patty and anybody else, if you want to also put your questions in the chat so that the rest of us can see them. And in that way, we will replicate, if we were all here in person, what the kind of chatter around the conference might be like. I think that'd be well worth doing. I completely sympathise with your question about the Labour Party's position on a lot of this, which needs a considerable amount of work, to say the very least. Manicandan.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I'd like to underline that so the development nature of the WTO has been, the multilateral system has been undermined, and so the kind of joint statement initiative processes and is in fact it's weakening the multilateral processes, and moreover many of these areas of electronic commerce, investment facilitation, and MSMEs, joint statement initiatives, and service domestic regulation, and even the e-commerce moratorium and the other climate change initiatives. It's all seems it's all going in a unidirectional in terms of seeking more and more market access and putting more burden on developing countries in implementing, taking more commitments. And while the interest of developing countries, particularly in agriculture and other critical area of technology transfer and addressing their own the developmental challenges is deeply ignored. And in order to have a genuine developmental processes, and we need to come back to keep the development at the core and genuine democratic processes at the core in the multilateral processes.
Thanks, Manny. Luciana?
Yeah, I was thinking about Stephen's question. Yeah, this is like, it's a very good question. I think that my words are related not so much to strategy, but on how we frame that strategy. I mean, it's like, you know, this idea of how how a war is planned. A battle is a war is planned by the militaries. Is this idea of having an objective, building a strategy, and the tactics have to do with the strategy. So if the tactics are not going towards the strategy, then you have a problem. It's like everything starts being like a strange nest, like a bird nest. It's like, so the idea is that we have to acknowledge that if we take WTO reform as one of the tactics where we participate as part of a strategy, which is to modify trade agenda, with the objective of changing the system, then it makes sense. But what I tend to see sometimes is that we focus too much on particular campaigns. It's because we don't have the people, we have little money, we do magic with the things we have, but we do have to remember all the time to have a systemic approach to, for example, not only WTO reform, but also when we discuss the free trade agreements, in particular, one trade agreement, one campaign, the TTIP campaign. I know that in Europe, it was very problematic when the TTIP was down, which was actually a victory. Then what do? So now ISDS, we're focusing on ISDS, which is perfect that we focus on ISDS also. But then if ISDS reform goes through and we push that, then what do? So we have like a problem of, well, now that we achieved this, what do? Is like everybody starts doing different things. That is a problem that we should sometimes be discussing, and we don't. We just respond to let's say what the system puts in front of us, and we are responsive all the time. So we're responding and answering, and that is a problem that we usually have. I don't know how to change that. I'm just pointing out the problem. I told you that I was going to do that today. I don't have the answers. I mean, but we have to think strategically. I mean, we have to bring back the idea of a strategy. What's the strategy behind the things we do? And if we can work together in that strategy, then it's easier, because then you can move some like, it's like a game, you know, like, well, I don't know in English how the name of the game is. Like, you start like walking these little cubes, and you start working, and you can go ahead like two blocks ahead, and then look back and see what's going on. We need that, because then we're all the time, otherwise we're all the time behind. And that is a problem that we have also in the Americas, huh? So it's like not only there. And I just wanted to say something. No, but BC is going to talk now about. Are you going to talk about the question on garments?
You can.
No, just one comment. But from a Latin American perspective, this is something that they are all the time saying, that what they want is, I mean, capital, right? Or the big policymakers want to bring investments, and one of the investment that they usually talk about also is garment industry. And it's like, for me, it's, when you look at the picture of how the world works and relocalization of production, so the internationalization of production, how it has worked in the past 40, 50 years, it makes no sense, because it is obvious that it has been so cheap to build these garments, or to prepare to manufacture these garments in the places where they have been using women who are very young, who are migrants, who are vulnerable, and with sex abuse. I mean, all the abuses and human rights violations on these women that work on garments or work in these processing zones, like in Maquila's zone in Mexico, in the northern part. So it's crazy to try to think that our countries will, for these guys, for the policymakers, they present to us that we will develop with bringing this kind of investment, and it seems to be so ridiculous. That's why we have to, and I'll finish with this, but we have to bring the data on, and we have to show data to journalists. We need more work with journalists to show them how the effects of this has been in other parts of the world, and how ridiculous is to think that bringing this kind of dirty jobs, dirty for the human rights, but for the environment too, is actually going to bring something good for populations, for example, in Latin America or in Africa, I'm sure too. I don't know what BC thinks about that. I'll finish there.
Great, thank you, Luciana. And I know we've gone slightly over, but if people can just hang on another couple of minutes. BC, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I'll be quick, so maybe 1.5 minutes. I agree with you, Luciana. And I think one thing I want to add to that is, you know, we tend to assume that the capital inflow is the thing, but that's one bit of it. Think about the industry that is used clothing and what it does to the opportunity to truly grow an industry, right? So you look at reports coming out of, you know, Kenya, for example, where, you know, Rwanda that has banned it, for example, it's killing the industry. It's just not making it possible to grow. The same thing happened in Nigeria many years ago. Look, I teach in Canada, I'm in Halifax, but I'm wearing a fabric from Ghana, right? And it's a personal decision to just say, you know what, support that industry and move it out and renormalize. But that's a very narrow example. The point here is that we should be careful of sensationalization of, you know, newspaper topics that is diverse from the reality of the ground. Capital inflow is one, but the industry needs to be protected and given the space to also grow. And that is not happening. As a result, amongst other things, by the importation of used clothing that floods the market. So I think that's one point I'll add to that. And, you know, I think Vahini really responded very well to the liberalization question. It is spearheaded primarily by the global North countries. And therefore, I don't think there's even much more to add to that. But I think Daniel's question is a very good one, which is, you know, what is the Global South perspective on this? You know, I think extending the decision is one thing, but we all knew that at the point where that was the decision we ended with, it simply ignored the kind of asks that South Africa, Brazil, and India asked of the WTO. And if you're thinking about it today, the plastics treaty that is being talked about, you can see similar arguments around, you know, the innovation that makes it possible is not being shared. and then there's nothing that is being transferred in terms of technology. So I think to end is to say we have to have multiple streams of responses. There are those that are systemic at the top. There are those that are, regional from below. But we also have to understand that the trade is part of a general international financial and economic system that we must deal with together. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. And it's just made me realize we have too few of these discussions. I think we had more of them 20 years ago, and it's we need to get back to it, because I could spend a week discussing this with all of you. I've learned so much today. I hope everybody on the other end of the webinar has. BC, Luciana, Mani, Vahini, thank you so much. Trade justice movement is 20 years old, and this is the second in a series of 3 webinars. The next one will be happening same time as this one on Wednesday, the 15th of November. It's called The Future of Trade, Trade Justice in a Changing Political Landscape. And I hope at that one we may be able to get into some more of the strategic questions as to where we as activists, campaigners, academics and experts go next. So a huge thank you to all of you for coming. Leo, TJM, any last announcements for you, or is that all good and we can close? Tom?
Yeah, nothing, just to say that I've put the link to register for the 3rd and final webinar in the chat. So looking forward to seeing as many of you there as can make it. And thanks to Nick for doing a great job chairing.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you mid-November.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.